Then God spoke to Noah, "Come out of the ark, you, your wife, your sons, and your sons' wives with you. Bring out all the living creatures that are with you, birds, livestock, those that crawl on the earth, and they will spread over the earth and be fruitful and multiply on the earth." Skipping down to verse 20. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord. He took some of every kind of clean animal and every kind of clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. When the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, he said to himself, "I will never again curse the ground because of human beings, even though the inclinations of their heart is evil from youth onward. And I will never again strike down every living thing as I have done. As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, and day and night will not cease." God blessed Noah and his sons and said to him, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." Skipping to chapter 9, verse 11. "I establish my covenant with you that never again will every creature be wiped by the floodwaters, that there will never again be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, 'This is the sign of the covenant I am making between me and every living creature with you, a covenant for all generations. I have placed my bow in the clouds. It will be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth.'" Chapter 9, verse 18. Noah's sons who came out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. These three were the sons that were Noah's sons, and from them the whole earth was populated. Noah, as a man of the soil, began by planting a vineyard. He drank some of the wine, became drunk, and uncovered himself inside the tent. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father naked and told his two brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a cloak and placed it over both their shoulders, and walking backwards, they covered their father's nakedness. Their faces were turned away, and they did not see their father naked. When Noah awoke from his drinking and learned what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Canaan is cursed. He will be the lowest of slaves to his brothers." He also said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem. Let Canaan be Shem's slave. Let God extend Japheth. Let Japheth dwell in the tents of Shem. Let Canaan be Shem's slave." Now Noah lived 350 years after the flood. So Noah's life lasted 950 years, and then he died.
So when I was growing up in school, I got in trouble all the time for forgetting stuff. Anybody else had that problem growing up? All right, some of you, okay? Maybe it was homework I was supposed to turn in. Maybe it was some permission slip I was supposed to get signed. Or maybe I just showed up to school and was like, "Oh, we have a test today. I forgot about that," right? And I remember I always got told, if you cared about this, you wouldn't forget. And I'm like, no, I really care about it. I just forgot. So maybe that's partially true. I don't know. Because as I've gotten older, I still forget about things. It honestly has not gotten that much better. The reality is, even for those of us in here who have the best of memories, we forget things. And so what we do is we develop systems that help us remember things. A lot of times, especially if we're just trying to remember tasks or projects that we're supposed to complete, we'll have systems like, I've tried them all, sticky notes, all over my desk. I've got that. To-do list, I have to-do list on certain apps. On my phone, I have to-do lists on random physical papers, and I now have to-do lists on my new Kindle Scribe because I can make to-do lists there. So they're in multiple places, very different to-do lists than every one. So any other number of attempts at trying to remember things doesn't always work. But that's one way of remembering things. Another way of remembering things are maybe things that are more sentimental to us. So maybe you have a knickknack that you keep around just to remind you of a loved one that has passed on. Maybe you have a prayer card on a fridge to remember some missionaries that we've sent, maybe some of your friends, remind you to pray for someone. Maybe you set an alert on your phone to help you remember that it's somebody's birthday, or maybe even your own anniversary, right? These are things that we'll do to help us remember. So for me to remember to pray for our missionary friends, the Kays, who just recently moved to Vietnam, what I have to remember them is, you can judge me, but a couple of travel-size Malibu rum shooters. So if you don't know what those are, that's fine. You don't need to know. But so they have no purpose other than the fact that for some reason they had them with them when we were dropping them off at the airport. And so they gave them to me when they were going through security. So now they're just sitting there, and it is what I remember to pray for them by. So I should probably just get a prayer card or something. That's probably better, but it's all good. It's just something that when I look at it sitting there on my desk, it reminds me to pray for them. It reminds me to think of them. In the scripture text that you just heard read, we're told that God actually sets up something to help him remember. That's the way it's described, and I'm going to explain what that is. But the idea is that God will look at this sign and remember an everlasting covenant that he's made with humans. But make no mistake, God is not setting up the sign so that he doesn't forget in the way that we often do. The sign is primarily there to ensure us and remind us that his covenant promises toward his people are from everlasting to everlasting, and they will never change. So good morning again, church. Like I said earlier, welcome to this gathering of New Eden. I hope that you're encouraged by our time in the scriptures. As you heard read, and as you can see, we're continuing in the Genesis narrative this morning. Like I said, we're going to be in chapter 8, verse 15, all the way through the end of chapter 9. When we're covering these larger chunks, sometimes it might be helpful to have the physical text out in front of you, because sometimes we just have to bounce around because we're covering larger chunks. So if you want to, feel free to have that out. We will try to have the text on the screen as we can. So quick review to catch us up, and I mean real quick. Genesis 1, God creates the archetype humans, Adam and Eve, and quickly we see things delve into wickedness to the point that God sees that, and in sorrow and grief, he chooses to accelerate the cosmic collapse that humanity has set off by their rebellion. So things get really bad. But through that, as we saw last week, coming through the flood, this cosmic collapse, God chose to provide a salvation for a remnant through a wooden vessel called the ark. And so our story this week picks up with the waters have receded and the family gets off the ark into this brand new world. It is Noah and his wife. It is their 3 sons and each of their wives. And then all of the animals get off the ark. So that's where we're starting our story today. So quick roadmap. So we can kind of digest this story. Like I said, we're going to jump around a little bit, but here's the 3 main ideas that we're going to work through together. So the first one that we're going to see is brand new beginnings. Brand new beginnings. The second theme or idea we're going to see is same old sin. Same old sin. And the last thing we'll see during our time together is never ending grace. Never ending grace. So let's start by looking together at our first theme, brand new beginnings. You heard Sarah read this just a moment ago, but I want to look again at Genesis chapter 8, verse 15, where our text picks up. And let's read just a little bit of this. It says, "Then God spoke to Noah, 'Come out of the ark, you, your wife, your sons, and your sons' wives with you. Bring out all the living creatures that are with you.'" So Noah's told to come out, and he's told to bring out the creatures with him. So God brings them safely through the waters. Just like he told Noah to go into the ark, now he calls Noah out of the ark. This idea of an ark later in the Hebrew scriptures would be understood often as a chest or a coffin. And there's the sense in which Noah and those with him are being brought out of a tomb into this new beginning, this new life. I've mentioned this before, even last week, but the language that we read in Genesis 8 and 9 is clearly telling us a recreation story. The waters have been pushed back, the dry land has appeared, and Noah is like the new Adam. He and his family and the animals are recommissioned. The same thing we read in Genesis 1, "Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth with my glory." In verse 22 of chapter 8, God promises that the daily and seasonal rhythms that are necessary for the flourishing of human life, that they will continue as long as the earth endures. So in spite of humanity's attempt to destroy God's good creation, in his grace, he gives them a new beginning or a fresh start. And so Noah, experiencing all this, more than anybody probably, he's walked with God for a long time, and he comes through the flood, and he responds to this deliverance with an act of worship. This most likely is not an atonement sacrifice. It is simply an offering of gratitude. He builds this altar and he takes all of the clean animals. This would have been a lot. And he throws it on the altar and he offers what's called a burnt sacrifice. That's also later called a whole offering. It's the idea that it is full sacrifice and surrender. It's completely burnt up. And this is the response of Noah, and honestly, the response of anybody who has realized how radically dependent they are on God and has come face to face with the abundant mercy and grace that has been offered them. This is the natural reaction of seeing the mercies of God, is just offering up all in a heart of gratitude and worship. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul will build on this idea in Romans 12:1. He will say, therefore, so after 11 chapters of just expounding the goodness and the beauty of God, he says, in light of all of this, in view of the mercies of God, let's start there. In light of that, I urge you, present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing, same word, pleasing here, this aroma that's pleasing to God. This is your true worship. Worship is not just singing songs. That's just continuing in worship corporately. As we live and our lives are surrendered to him, then that is our worship. But this does not happen by just white knuckling it. It happens as we gaze deeply on the mercies of God. And this was the response of Noah. And we're told that this offering was soothing or pleasing to God. And the author in Genesis continues to employ human characteristics to describe God here, to help us understand it. And he describes God breathing in the aroma of this sacrifice and it being pleasing. Now, obviously, the idea here is not that the actual smell of burnt flesh is what was pleasing to God, right? That was no more pleasing to God than the smell of cat food through downtown Decatur after a good rain, right? That's not the idea here. It is that the simple response of worship from a heart of gratitude, it encourages God, it soothes him, it comforts him, especially after we just read of him in his grief having to destroy the earth. This is also clearly contrasting other flood accounts from the Mesopotamian area, which I mentioned last week. There's other accounts. And in those accounts, the gods are depicted as having to stop the flood after 7 days because they're starving, because they're fully dependent on the sacrifices to survive. And so they stop the flood early, and there's a sacrifice offer, and they ravenously come down and just eat it up because they're starving. They're dependent on humans for their existence. But that is not the God of the scriptures. As Paul preached to the crowds in Athens, God is not served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives everyone life and breath and all things. This is beautiful, church. This isn't a genie God that we can just kind of bargain with. Well, I'm going to withhold sacrifice so you'll give me what I want. No, he gives us fully, and we just, in gratitude, give offerings of worship. And he desires this for us, not because he's needy, but because he has designed you and created you, and he knows that you are most whole, you are most fully human when you are in complete surrender to his ways and his purposes. This is the picture we get of Noah coming out of the ark. The sun is shining, a new day has dawned, and a brand new beginning has commenced. And if you were following this story for the first time, you might be full of hope, with anticipation that maybe the potential for this tov or goodness, the Hebrew word for good, that God creates everything and calls it good and he invites humans to spread this, maybe now we're gonna get there and it'll happen. Maybe the goodness and tov of God's good world will expand. But if you pay close attention and you keep reading, you're going to recognize that yes, this is a recreation of sorts. There's things that are similar, but there are things that are different. And this brings us to our second main theme. We saw brand new beginnings, and now we see the same old sin. Genesis 8:21, this is right after Noah's, as he's offering the sacrifice. It says, when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, he said to himself, I will never again curse the ground because of human beings, even though, or for is the word there, or because the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth onward, and I will never again strike down every living thing as I have done. Even when humans are at their best, giving offerings and sacrifices and gratitude, God is honest about their state. The same language that God uses of mankind being evil, and because of this, he was grieved in his heart and sends the flood to cleanse all things. Here it's the same language that God literally says to himself. The word literally means in his heart, when he says to himself that he will not do it again for the exact same reason. This seems almost illogical. The idea here is man is so inclined toward evil even from his youth, but God in his grace concedes, because if he were to strike down all who had evil or ra, the opposite of tov, If he were to strike down all who had that in their hearts, this would be a never-ending cycle of destroying each generation as evil expands. So what does he do? He places some things in place to curb the evil. This wasn't the original ideal, but he gives us some things. In verses 2-4 of chapter 9, we're told that in contrast to where it was in Eden, where animals and humans were in harmony with each other, now animals will live in fear and terror of humans because they are now given as food for humans. Not only that, we see conflict between animals and humans, but we also see more conflict with humans with each other. And God has to give warnings against murder in verses 5 and 6 of chapter 9. He says that if someone sheds human blood in murder of their, I think the CSB says fellow man, the word literally is brother, their brother, that if that happens, that he will require, the word there also means take account of that life, so he's going to notice it, and that their own blood will then be shed by humans. And the reason he gives is because humans are created in God's image. Again, that creation language. Now, the main point here is not God setting up a decree of punishment that all nations have to follow. In fact, God didn't even follow this in dealing with Cain. He gave Cain mercy after he killed his own brother. What is going on, though, is God is simply telling humans what will happen as a result of their sin. If you remember after Adam and Eve sinned in the garden, he said, this is what's going to happen. This is the division that takes place. And here he says, violence and death will lead to more violence and death. And this has proven to be true throughout the centuries. There is not a generation or a culture that has not engaged in this vicious cycle. What seems to be happening is that God is meeting humans where they're at, in their brokenness. He's making some concessions because of the hardness of the hearts of humanity. It's the same reason we do see the law come into the picture later. Because of sin. That's what Paul tells us. The idea is to curb evil in this new world, but the relationship that we saw pictured in the garden does not seem to be there. And so all the details of what exactly that means, one thing is clear. God has brought forth a new beginning, but things are far from the idyllic image of Eden where God walked about in the garden in the cool of the day with Adam and Eve. Even though the earth has been purged, the problem of sin in the hearts of humans still remains. And this only is proven to get worse in the aftermath of the flood story. We read the entirety of chapter 9, verses 18-29, this almost weird story of Noah and his sons. We see Noah come out of the ark. We're told that he begins his role as a gardener. The text calls him a man of the soil. This is reminding us of Adam, who was from the dirt. Noah is the new Adam. And like the original story, he cultivates the ground. He plants a garden or a vineyard. And just like the first humans, Adam and Eve, he partakes of the fruit in an unlawful way. He overindulges in the wine and becomes drunk. Now, the text doesn't really paint Noah as a rebellious person in this act, but at minimum, it does reveal his folly. It's also showing us that just like Adam was supposed to steward over creation, but instead he was ruled by it, in the same way, Noah, the fruit of the earth, controls him instead of him cultivating it and controlling it and stewarding it. Now, wine in and of itself wasn't the issue. The scriptures speak often of wine as a good gift to be used in the right manner. But the overuse and misuse of wine, being controlled by it, will later be explicitly warned against. And the text, I love it, it doesn't hide Noah's failure in this regard. And as a result of his folly, he winds up naked in his own tent. We're told that while he is in that state, his son Ham comes in and sees him and tells his brothers of it. This is where it gets a little confusing for us culturally. The text doesn't explicitly say what's going on. It's intentionally vague. We're also culturally very far removed from this culture. So we don't know exactly what happened with Ham and Noah, but whatever it is, the story is clear that it wasn't a good thing. Commentators have wrestled with this text. There's a variety of views out there, a couple that I think are the most compelling. It could be as simple as Ham looking at his indecent father, and this was an act of dishonor. There are many who believe it's much darker. The language used here of Ham seeing his father's nakedness, it is a euphemism throughout the scriptures used to describe someone going into the tent of his parents and sexually abusing his father's wife or his mother in the presence of his drunk father. Not always his mother, sometimes his father's wife. I know that's like seems weird to us and maybe it feels like I'm making a leap, but culturally this was referenced and it would be done by sons as a power play and a way to shame their fathers and seize power. Later stories in the Bible, we see examples of that. Absalom did that with David's concubines later, and he was even advised to do that as a way to seize power. It also might explain why Ham goes out and tells his brothers. Was he bragging about this act, seizing power, expecting them to become his slaves or his servants? Leviticus 18 specifically uses the euphemism of uncovering your father's nakedness to explicitly prohibit the Israelites from doing this very act, from having sexual relations with their father's wife. And it's called uncovering your father's nakedness. It's also interesting that it's noted in Leviticus 18 that that is often done by none other than the Canaanite people, these descendants of Ham, okay? It also would explain why Noah knew something was done, why he responds so severely. And maybe is this why he cursed Canaan? Maybe this was the illicit offspring of this abusive sexual act. The reality is we don't really know. So I'm not going to make a strong statement one way or the other. But at the end of it, we do know that something happened that caused Noah to speak up for the first time in the narrative. These are the only words we actually hear Noah speak. He ends up just like the first humans, naked and shamed. His nakedness also has to be covered up by someone else. So the story is giving us this cycle. Shem and Japheth do this covering up of their father. They try to rectify the situation as best they can, but clearly this is just covering up something that was broken. The same old sin is still here, and the cycle repeats itself. Just like Adam and Eve story ends in cursing and division among family, so too does Noah's story. Y'all see the cycle is continuing. Noah speaks up. He curses Ham's son, Canaan. We'll look a little bit closer at the implications of that curse next week as we look at the genealogies in chapter 10 on through chapter 11. But it is important to note this is a curse that doesn't come directly from God. This comes from Noah. And even though it's called a curse, it's really part prayer, part prophecy. The language of let, it's used over and over and over 4 different times when Noah is speaking. He says, let Canaan be Shem's slave. Let God extend Japheth. Let. It kind of gives us this language of prayer. But then later fulfillment of this implies that it's also partly a prophecy. And so we have this taking place, and after all is said and done, after we get this kind of weird story placed here, we actually finish the genealogy that we started back in chapter 5. Okay, I don't know if you noticed, but in chapter 5, we started the genealogy. All these things happened, and he died, and he died, and he died. And then we actually got a long break to get the flood story, and then it finishes it in verse 28. Now Noah lived 350 years after the flood, so Noah's life lasted 950 years. Then he died. Same pattern back in chapter 5. I know that story is a little weird. I know like some of this like maybe sits uneasy with this. And that might be the point. The hope that Noah would be the one. His name means rest. Because they hoped that he would be the one to bring blessing and rest from the curse. That is not fulfilled by him. In fact, the last story we read is about him cursing his own descendants, his own offspring. Division still reigns, even between family members and brothers. It seems to even get worse. Death still has the final word. Noah's story ends with, and he died. Brand new beginning, great. Same old sin, still infecting humanity, still ruling and reigning in the world. And that same old sin is no different today. We know of brokenness. We know of pain. But thankfully, tucked in the middle of this narrative is a promise that God gives us that rest from the curse is still possible. But it won't come from Noah. It'll come from God himself. And this is where we see the last theme from our text, never-ending grace. We saw it a little bit earlier. God knows that man's inclinations are evil, but he is still committed to them. this is wild. He knows what is coming. He knows the rest of the story, yet he makes a promise in his own heart. So the first time this promise is described, it's told in his own heart. He doesn't say it out loud, that he will not once again strike every living thing. But for our benefit, for Noah's benefit, for the family's benefit, he says this promise out loud for the whole world to hear as well. He goes on to make a covenant that he says is permanent for all generations, that he will not send another flood to destroy the earth and all living creatures. In chapter 9, verses 12 through 13, he even gives this public sign of the covenant. He says, I'm putting this rainbow in the clouds. And it still exists today. Still after a rain, we can go out and look at this sevenfold rainbow. Interestingly, the text says that the rainbow is for God's purposes, that he may see it and remember. The text says it twice, I think. But just as the author recorded that God remembered Noah in the ark, to remind the readers of this text that God did not forget Noah, in the same way, this story is recorded to remind us to remember when we see the sign of grace after a storm. God will not forget his covenant. As one commentator says, this is God's way of willingly tying his own hands to his covenant promise. It's like when you post on Facebook that you're starting to diet because you say hold you accountable, right? Well, if I say it out loud, then it's going to work. Now, we don't keep our promises, so it doesn't always work, right? But that's what God is doing. He's publicly saying, I'm so committed to this that I'm going to let the whole world know that when you see this, you'll remember my promise. I think the most interesting thing about this covenant sign is the word here is not actually that of rainbow. The CSB translates it as bow, which is actually what the word is. Now, the context does allow for the translation of rainbow, but the idea here is bow. When God says he won't strike humanity again, that is warrior language. You'll see it come up later in the Psalms. It's a war term, and it conjures up images of a weapon being used to strike down an opponent. And so the incredible sign that is given to us is this: God is hanging up his bow. And this is a permanent covenant promise that begins a theme that continues throughout the entirety of the scriptures. We don't have time to look at all the different covenants. This one is typically referred to as the Noahic covenant, and there are many more given. What's interesting about this covenant, and most of them, is that they are unilateral. It is not dependent on humanity keeping up their end of the bargain. In fact, the covenant begins with God saying, I know they won't, so I'm just going to make this promise myself. He commits to them and hangs up his bow in radical mercy. Later in the prophets, as this theme of covenant kind of unwinds, it kind of builds us to this prediction of something called a new covenant that Jeremiah talks about. And it's what all these promises are pointing us to. We're told that in those days when the new covenant comes, there will be no more need for written laws because everyone will personally know the Lord. You won't have to go around trying to teach people and curb evil because the law will be written on our hearts, and hearts of stone will be ripped out and replaced with hearts of flesh. And the writer of Hebrews, we heard it read earlier, explicitly tells us that it's Jesus that is the one that will see to this happening. He is the mediator of this new covenant. It's why Paul can say all the promises that God has ever made find their yes in Jesus. He's the truly righteous one who will bring this covenant not based on works, but based on grace. And in this new covenant, there will be no more need for concessions and just these laws simply trying to curb evil. Let me just, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, just try to stop it from expanding anymore. That's the best we can do, is just kind of manage it. That's what the law does. It just manages it and gives an appearance of stopping something. But you know what Paul says? It might give an appearance, but it is of zero value in curbing the indulgences of the flesh. It doesn't work. You can yell it as loud as you want. You can take it line by line and shove it down someone's face. But if a worldwide destructive flood didn't change the hearts of human, you yelling the law louder and louder will not work. God has something bigger in mind, to take hearts of stone and turns them to hearts of flesh that love his ways, love his path. That's something deeper, more transformative that has to happen. But that's what Jesus does. He is the truly righteous one. Isaiah 53 talks about him being stricken and smitten of God. It might be hard for us to understand sometimes, but when we recognize that Jesus is God and he willingly took that cosmic bow and turned it on himself, that the sum of all our iniquities and the sum of all the wrath of God against sin that destroys his good world was laser focused on the Son of God. He bears in his body all of our iniquities. He becomes accursed for us, hanging on a tree, all the curses he takes on himself. He becomes the lowest of slaves to make us his brothers and sisters, even though we were his enemies. And in doing this, he is the one that is reversing the curse. He's reuniting the true family of God. We're going to see it next week. All nations, tribes, and tongues. He is doing all this. All the mess that we've read in the Genesis narrative. We're only 9 chapters in, guys. It gets a lot darker and a lot worse. Even though the lives of those who hung him on a cross and murdered him should have been required, he hangs on a cross, even though he had every right to strike them down. And instead he says, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they do. He was laid, buried in death, but he comes out just like Noah was called out of the ark. And if you remember, the women see him alive in John and they think he's a gardener. They don't fully recognize him. And then their eyes are open. They're like, it's Jesus. And they were half right. But he's not just some gardener like managing one little garden. He's the cosmic gardener that's bringing a new beginning. But this time, guys, sin has been defeated. When, just like Noah, when he was called to come out of the ark and he brought others with him, when we identify with Christ, he brings us out of death and sin to new life with him. And for those who are in Christ, there is no more same old sin. It has been stomped out. The death blow has been dealt. And so though we still see it, though we still find ourselves falling short, the reality is we're just waiting the consummation and realization of what Christ has already been accomplished. When the Father sees you, he sees not your baggage and your mess and your sin and your brokenness. He knew you were going to sin. He knows you're going to sin again. Yet he still went to the cross, and what the Father sees is the goodness and righteousness of the Son. The primary posture of the Father toward you is not sitting there waiting for you to finally get it right. He knows the inclinations of your heart apart from him are evil from your youth. But because when we are in Christ, we are transformed, and now his primary posture towards you is one of love, and the smile of the Father gazes on you. This new kingdom has begun. It will be fully realized one day. We're in the already not yet. I know that's hard. That's why we have signs of the new covenant. Do you know one day we're going to stop taking communion because we're going to get to feast in the eternal kingdom forever? This is why Jesus installed communion. He tells his disciples right before he goes to the cross, he institutes what's called the new sign of the covenant. The sign of the new covenant is right here. That's why we take it every week to remind us. We take the bread and the wine. It represents the sacrifice of his body and blood for the forgiveness of sins. And he says, this is my body, this is my blood. And Jesus even himself says, I'm not going to do this again until I do it with you in the new kingdom. At the marriage supper of the Lamb, when we all feast around the table, all things are made new. Wine will be consumed in joy, not folly. And this sign right here, just like the bow in the sky, is given to those who are in Christ to remind us, church. It's a means of grace to cause you to remember his eternal promise. Those that come to Jesus will never be cast out. And this is all received by grace alone, through faith alone. This is not of any work you can do. Humans have no good apart from God. So what are you called to do? Simply trust. Quit working, quit striving, receive by faith the life, death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, what we commonly call and sum up by saying the gospel. And when that happens, you receive his life in exchange for yours. And this actually begins to change us. It's not just this sweet by and by narrative. That consummation is a piece of it, but that breaks forth into the presence and is revealed in this new family called the church. That's why we need each other. We were created to be in communion together. I need you. When I'm tempted to doubt that God's gonna keep his promise of redemption, because I see my own heart and my brokenness, I need you to remind me that God is faithful. When I fail to believe that God is altogether good and I say, how could he? I need someone to remind me of his goodness. When I begin to think that something could come between me and the Father, that there's something that could separate me from his love, I need you to remind me that there is nothing that can separate us from the love of God. When I think I have to earn this and work my way back into God's good graces, because my authority figures growing up stood at a distance until I kind of figured it out and they had to have time to cool off. That's not God. He doesn't need time to cool off. He sees you and he loves you. We need to remind each other. And as we begin to believe this, as the Spirit graciously, in view of the mercies of God, reminds us of that and renews our hearts and minds, we experience change and transformation. Do you realize what's going on? As we gather as the church, we are the inversion of the broken families that we're reading about. Instead of family becoming strangers and enemies, enemies and strangers have become family. We don't belong in the same room, right? I've said it before. I know your political views. I know your views on Calvinism and Arminianism. A couple of you will laugh about that if you're on Facebook. I know that, guys. But together, centered around the gospel, we are the church, and this is a foretaste of what's to come. Unity, harmony, goodness. Not because you guys are great. I know y'all know me. We're not that great. But the Spirit of God, the very one that raised Christ from the dead, lives in our midst, in our hearts. Ephesians says that the purpose of us existing as the church is to display a sign to the cosmic powers of the world, the glory of God, through ordinary, everyday acts, counterculturally. As we live, we begin to believe that we are our brother's keeper. We are our sister's keeper. We don't respond like Cain and say, that's not my problem. No, we pursue. And you guys do this well, but I want to continue to encourage you. And you see someone that used to be here all the time and they're not, not to shame them, but hey, how are things going? How are you guys doing? We can check in on them when we haven't seen them for a while, maybe in our community groups or growth partnerships or here at the gathering. Maybe we know someone's wandering astray and we're like, I don't really know how to deal with it. It'll be okay. Just reach out and say, I don't even really know what to say. I've heard some things and I want to know how you're doing. We pursue them. We need to give of ourselves willingly, not out of compulsion. Guys, we don't beg you guys to do something and want you. I'd rather you not do it. But not out of compulsion, but willingly saying, hey, I'm going to give up my life, whether that's my time, my energy, my talents, my treasures, whatever, as a living sacrifice, not so I get recognized, but for the faith of others. That's how Paul describes it, that he was willing, strong language, to be poured out as a sacrificial offering for the faith of others. We can become a people who cover the shame of others by dignifying them, hearing their stories, loving them to Jesus. We can be a place where people can be fully known, but still fully loved. That's supernatural, guys. That doesn't just happen. We can welcome newcomers into our midst with joy. We know how it was to be in that seat. We were the strangers. We were the outcasts. Go, hey, how are you doing? And I get it. I am not, y'all might think I'm more, I can't remember the word, extroverted than I am. But I'm not really. So I struggle with this. But we can meet people, put ourselves out there. Right? And so those are just examples. Everybody has different personalities, different gifts. But together, all this done, not out of compulsion, but simply in view of the radical mercies of God, that he has saved us, that he has delivered us, and he has promised to keep us until the end, till he presents us pure and whole. So be encouraged, guys. As you feel conviction, awesome, great. But be encouraged. God's going to complete the work. It's his work, not yours. And so he's going to finish it. He will not forget your labor of love. And he will keep his covenant promises toward his people from eternity to eternity.